Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Matilda by Roald Dahl. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Roald Dahl's Matilda, published in 1988, is one of his most beloved works, capturing the imagination of readers with its witty humor, heartfelt themes, and memorable characters. The novel follows the story of Matilda Wormwood, a brilliant young girl with an insatiable love for books and an extraordinary mind. However, her intelligence is neither recognized nor appreciated by her neglectful parents and the tyrannical headmistress of her school, Miss Trunchbull. Instead, it is Matilda's kind-hearted teacher, Miss Honey, who sees her true potential and encourages her. The story masterfully blends elements of childhood resilience, the importance of education, and the power of standing up against injustice. While Matilda does not have a direct predecessor, its themes align with Dahl's earlier works that feature children overcoming adversity, such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the BFG. The book was also subject to some controversy, primarily due to its depiction of harsh authority figures and its celebration of a child outsmarting adults. Despite this, it remains a classic, adapted into a successful film, a stage musical, and later a Netflix adaptation. With its mix of humor, fantasy, and inspiring messages, Matilda continues to captivate audiences worldwide. Now, let's begin the story. Matilda Wormwood was no ordinary child. From the moment she could speak, it was clear that her mind worked in ways far beyond her years. While most children her age were just learning to form simple sentences, Matilda had already taught herself to read by the time she was 3. She started with newspapers and magazines lying around the house, absorbing words and meanings with remarkable ease. But for Matilda, words were not just symbols on a page. They were doorways into new worlds. By the time she turned 4, Matilda had moved on to more challenging material. With no books at home, since her parents had no interest in reading, she discovered the library, a place that became her sanctuary. She made the journey there alone, undeterred by the idea that a child of her age might not be expected to venture out on her own. The librarian, Mrs. Phelps, was astonished when she saw the tiny girl absorbed in Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Concerned at first that the book might be too complex for a child, she soon realized that Matilda not only understood it, but was utterly enthralled by its story. The library became Matilda's second home. She devoured books with a hunger that no one around her could comprehend. She read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, and countless others. Through literature, she traveled through time and space, experiencing adventures far removed from her own dreary existence. She felt the icy wind of the Russian countryside in Anna Karenina, stood beside Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, and soared across the Atlantic with Ernest Hemingway. It was in these pages that Matilda discovered the richness of the world, a world that was so unlike her own. For despite her incredible intelligence, her home life was anything but nurturing. Matilda's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, were the very embodiment of ignorance and cruelty. Mr. Wormwood was a crooked used car salesman, thriving on deception and dishonesty. He prided himself on cheating customers and boasted about his shady business dealings at the dinner table. He would explain, with great relish, how he tampered with car mileage, replaced expensive parts with cheap ones, and painted over rust to make worthless vehicles look brand new. In his eyes, intelligence was not something to be admired. Cunning and trickery were the real keys to success. Mrs. Wormwood, on the other hand, was a woman of vanity and shallowness. She cared little for her daughter's remarkable abilities, dismissing them as useless. She spent most of her days watching mindless television programs and playing bingo, convinced that her own way of life was the pinnacle of achievement. The idea that a child would rather read a book than watch television was, to her, utterly absurd. Matilda's older brother, Michael, was the only child her parents seemed to care about. Unlike Matilda, he was unremarkable in every way, but because he showed interest in his father's business, he was favored. Mr. Wormwood would ruffle his son's hair and proudly proclaim that Michael would one day inherit the car dealership, as if that were the greatest possible destiny. Matilda, however, was treated as nothing more than an inconvenience. Her father, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in belittling her. He would scoff at her love of reading, call her names like "stupid girl," and dismiss her intelligence as if it were some meaningless quirk. He once ripped up one of her library books, declaring that she was wasting her time with all that reading nonsense. Matilda, though, was not the type to break under such treatment. If her parents refused to recognize her brilliance, she would not beg for their approval. Instead, she would find her own way of making things right. From an early age, Matilda developed a keen sense of justice. She believed that those who wronged others should face consequences, and if her parents would not treat her with kindness, she would ensure they faced small, clever punishments of her own design. Her first act of defiance was simple, yet deeply satisfying. She knew that her father was vain and obsessed with his slicked-back hair. Every morning, he would stand before the mirror, admiring himself as he combed his dark hair and applied a thick layer of his special hair tonic. One afternoon, while her parents were out, Matilda sneaked into the bathroom and replaced the tonic with her mother's platinum blonde hair dye. The next morning, Mr. Wormwood strutted into the breakfast room as usual, expecting to be greeted with admiration. Instead, his wife and son gasped in horror. His hair had turned an unmissable shade of bright silver. He caught sight of his reflection in a spoon and let out a shriek, convinced that he had somehow aged overnight. Matilda sat quietly at the table, pretending to be engrossed in her book, savoring the moment. But Matilda's creativity did not stop there. She wanted her father to learn that cruelty had consequences, and so she devised an even more elaborate trick. She knew his habits well, how he came home from work, plopped into his favorite armchair, and immediately turned on the television. So, she borrowed a parrot from a neighbor and hid it inside the sitting room's chimney before dinner. That evening, as Mr. Wormwood settled in, eerie voices began to echo through the room. "Hello, hello, rattle my bones." The family froze. The voice was coming from the fireplace. "Help me, let me out," Mrs. Wormwood shrieked, clutching her chest. Michael stared in terror. Mr. Wormwood turned pale, his bravado gone. He leapt from his chair, eyes darting around the room. "It's a ghost," Mrs. Wormwood wailed. The parrot, hearing all the commotion, squawked louder. "Help, I'm trapped." Mr. Wormwood bolted from the room, his confidence shattered. For a man who prided himself on being in control, the idea of a haunted house was too much to bear. The family slept uneasily that night, and Matilda smiled to herself, knowing she had won yet another round. These small acts of rebellion were Matilda's way of asserting herself in a world where she was constantly overlooked. She was not malicious. She simply believed in balance. If her parents treated her unfairly, then justice demanded that they experience a taste of their own medicine. Despite her intelligence and independence, Matilda was still just a child, longing for kindness and understanding. She found this, to some extent, in Mrs. Phelps, the librarian, who never discouraged her thirst for knowledge. But Matilda knew that one day she would have to step beyond the walls of the library and face the challenges of the outside world. She hoped that school might offer her the intellectual stimulation and companionship she craved. Perhaps there would be a teacher who would understand her, someone who would see her not as a nuisance, but as a remarkable mind full of potential. But Matilda had yet to meet the formidable Miss Trunchbull, the headmistress, who ruled her future school with an iron fist. Matilda had always known that her parents did not value intelligence, but it wasn't until she started school that she realized just how different she was from other children. Unlike her father, who spent his days swindling customers at his used car dealership, and her mother, who wasted away in front of the television or at the bingo hall, Matilda craved knowledge. Books had already opened countless doors for her, but now she was stepping into a new world, one where she hoped to find real learning, structure, and perhaps even someone who would recognize her brilliance. On the first day of school, Matilda entered Crunkham Hall Primary, an austere, red bricked building that loomed over its young students like a fortress. The place smelled of chalk dust and polished floors, and the air buzzed with the nervous chatter of children meeting their classmates for the first time. Matilda, though curious, remained composed. She had spent so much time in the world of books that the idea of school, with its lessons and teachers, seemed like something she had already encountered through the pages of various stories. Matilda was placed in the lowest grade, where most of the children were just beginning to learn the alphabet and basic arithmetic. To her, the material was laughably easy. She had mastered multiplication years ago, and her reading ability far surpassed even the older students. But she soon realized that her new teacher, Miss Honey, was different from the adults she had encountered at home. Miss Jennifer Honey was a gentle and soft-spoken woman, with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor that contrasted sharply with the imposing presence of the school's headmistress, Miss Trunchbull. From the moment she saw Matilda, Miss Honey sensed there was something special about her. She noticed how the little girl sat patiently while the other children struggled through simple sums. When she asked the class what 2 times 4 was, most hesitated, some guessed, and others mumbled under their breath. But Matilda, without missing a beat, answered 8. Miss Honey blinked. It was not uncommon for a child to know such a simple multiplication fact, but there was something in Matilda's tone, calm, assured, and utterly confident, that made her wonder. She decided to test further. "What about 12 times 7?" she asked, watching Matilda closely. 94, Matilda responded immediately. A few children giggled, thinking she had made a mistake. Miss Honey frowned slightly. "Are you sure?" Matilda gave her a patient look. "Yes," she said. "It's 84. Miss Honey felt a thrill run through her. This child wasn't simply clever, she was extraordinary. She continued the impromptu quiz, pushing Matilda with increasingly difficult numbers, and each time the girl answered instantly and correctly. Finally, Miss Honey took a piece of chalk and wrote a long equation on the board. "What is 2 times 487? She asked, expecting Matilda to at least hesitate. 974, Matilda said without blinking. The classroom fell silent. Miss Honey had taught for years, but she had never encountered a child with such raw intellect. She glanced around at the other students, most of whom were still struggling with their times tables. It was obvious Matilda didn't belong in this class. She needed far more advanced material, but Miss Honey was not just impressed by Matilda's mathematical ability. She also noticed her reading skills. When she asked if anyone in the class could read a certain passage from a children's book, Matilda raised her hand and read it flawlessly, with inflection and understanding far beyond her years. When Miss Honey asked what books she had read, Matilda listed names that left her teacher in awe: Dickens, Austen, Hemingway, Steinbeck. These were authors that even older students struggled to grasp. Yet this tiny girl had not only read them, but comprehended their themes and narratives. Miss Honey knew at once that she had to speak to the headmistress. Matilda's brilliance was not something to be ignored. But speaking to Miss Trunchbull was no small feat. Miss Agatha Trunchbull, the headmistress of Crunkham Hall, was a tyrant in every sense of the word. A former hammer-throwing champion, she had the build of an Olympian and the temperament of a military general. She ruled the school with an iron fist, striking fear into both students and teachers alike. Her belief was simple. Children were nasty little creatures who needed to be beaten into submission. She relished in punishment, inventing cruel and unusual ways to discipline students who stepped out of line. Her most infamous method was the chokey, a terrifying cupboard lined with broken glass and rusty nails, where disobedient children were forced to stand for hours in complete darkness. The very mention of the chokey was enough to make even the bravest students tremble. Miss Honey, though fearful of Trunchbull, knew she had to try. She made her way to the headmistress's office, her hands trembling slightly as she knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the gruff reply. Miss Honey stepped inside, immediately feeling the oppressive presence of the headmistress. Trunchbull sat behind her enormous desk, towering over her like a mountain of muscle and menace. Her beady eyes narrowed as she looked at Miss Honey, who, despite being a teacher, always felt like a nervous schoolgirl in the older woman's presence. "What do you want?" Trunchbull barked. Miss Honey cleared her throat. "I've come to talk to you about a student, headmistress," she said carefully. "A girl in my class, Matilda Wormwood. She is exceptionally gifted. She can multiply large numbers in her head instantly, and her reading comprehension is beyond anything I've ever seen in a child her age. I believe she should be moved to a higher grade, perhaps even directly into the top class." Trunchbull snorted. "A Wormwood," she sneered. "That little brat. Her father sells disgusting second-hand cars, cheats people for a living. The man's a crook. I won't have his daughter causing trouble in my school." Miss Honey hesitated, taken aback by the sheer hostility in the headmistress's tone. "But Miss Trunchbull, surely you must see that her abilities are—" "I see nothing of the sort," Trunchbull interrupted. "All children are stupid, and if this Matilda thinks she's special, she can think again. She will stay where she is, and if I hear any nonsense about moving up grades, I'll see to it that she's put in the chokey myself." Miss Honey's heart sank. She had expected resistance, but not such outright cruelty. There was no reasoning with Trunchbull. No matter how brilliant Matilda was, the headmistress would never allow her to be recognized. Feeling defeated, Miss Honey left the office, her mind racing. She had to find another way to help Matilda. This was no ordinary child. She was a genius trapped in a system that refused to acknowledge her. And if Trunchbull was determined to keep Matilda down, Miss Honey would have to find a way to lift her up. Matilda had quickly discovered that school was not the sanctuary she had hoped it would be, at least not entirely. Though she had found kindness and encouragement in Miss Honey, the rest of Crunkham Hall was a nightmare under the rule of Miss Trunchbull. The headmistress loomed over the school like an unrelenting storm, terrorizing students with punishments so severe they bordered on the absurd. Stories of her cruelty were whispered in hushed tones among the children. How she had thrown a girl over the fence by her pigtails. How she had forced a boy to eat an entire chocolate cake as punishment for daring to take a piece. Matilda, however, was not the sort of child to cower in fear. If anything, injustice made her all the more determined to fight back, even if she had to do it in small, clever ways. And she had already proved to herself that she could. She had not forgotten how she had dealt with her father's arrogance and cruelty. The memory of her father's hair stiffened into an immovable mess of peroxide and oil still made her smile. That had been a small act of revenge, a subtle but satisfying retribution for his mistreatment of her. But at school, the stakes were higher. Here, children weren't just humiliated, they were brutalized. Her first real glimpse of Trunchbull's methods came in the form of a small girl named Amanda Thripp. Amanda was a sweet child, completely harmless, but she made the grave mistake of coming to school with 2 thick blonde pigtails. To anyone else, they were an innocent part of her appearance, but to Trunchbull, they were a crime. Trunchbull's hatred for pigtails was well known among the students, but Amanda had never believed the rumors until the headmistress grabbed her roughly by her pigtails and swung her around like an Olympic hammer thrower. The entire class watched in horror as Amanda was sent flying through the air, her small body flipping before landing in the schoolyard beyond the fence. Miraculously, she was unharmed, though dazed. But the message was clear: defiance, even unintentional, would not be tolerated under Trunchbull's rule. Matilda burned with anger. It was one thing to be treated poorly by her own family, but watching other innocent children suffer was something she could not abide. She needed to do something, but how? She had been thinking about Trunchbull's cruelty when a curious thing happened. One day, while sitting at the breakfast table with her family, she reached for her glass of water. As she did, she noticed something peculiar. The glass wobbled ever so slightly before she had even touched it. She paused, staring at it. Was it just her imagination? She tried again, focusing her mind on the glass, willing it to move. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw it tremble. The strange sensation left her breathless, but there was no time to dwell on it. Her father was droning on about a new scheme at his car dealership, boasting about how he had fooled yet another unsuspecting customer. Matilda, as always, listened with disgust. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the glass again. Had it really moved? Or was she imagining things? She decided she would test it. Sitting up, she placed a pencil on her bedside table and stared at it intently. She concentrated, her small hands clenched into fists, her mind reaching out toward the object. And then, with a sudden jolt, the pencil rolled an inch to the side. Matilda gasped. It was real. Something inside her had awakened. The realization sent a thrill through her. This wasn't just intelligence. This was something more, something different, something powerful. And maybe, just maybe, it was something she could use. Her first opportunity came when Miss Trunchbull barged into the classroom one morning. Every week, the headmistress made a habit of storming into random classes, looking for a child to punish. It didn't matter if they had done anything wrong, Trunchbull always found an excuse. That day, she set her sights on a boy named Bruce Bogtrotter. Bruce was a quiet, unassuming boy with a round face and a fondness for sweets. Trunchbull accused him of stealing a slice of her personal chocolate cake from the staff room. The accusation was absurd. Bruce, like all the other students, was too terrified to step foot anywhere near the staff room. But logic did not matter to Trunchbull. As punishment, she devised one of her most infamous torments yet. With the entire school gathered in the assembly hall, Trunchbull wheeled out an enormous chocolate cake, a monstrous thing, rich and gleaming under the lights. She announced that Bruce would eat the entire cake in front of everyone. If he failed, he would be thrown into the chokey. The students watched in horror as Bruce hesitantly picked up his fork and took the first bite. The cake was delicious, but there was no joy in eating it. Bite after bite, his face grew red, his breathing labored. Matilda clenched her fists. This was cruelty at its finest, forcing a child to turn something he loved into something painful and humiliating. But then, something remarkable happened. Bruce kept eating and eating and eating. His face was drenched in sweat, but his expression hardened into one of sheer determination. Bite by bite, he battled his way through the cake, refusing to give Trunchbull the satisfaction of watching him fail. The students began to realize what was happening. The mood shifted. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to cheers. "Go on, Bruce," someone yelled. And suddenly, the hall erupted into cheers. Matilda's heart swelled. For the first time, she saw it resistance. Even under the crushing rule of Trunchbull, Bruce was fighting back in his own way. Finally, with a last bite, Bruce finished the cake. The hall exploded in applause. Trunchbull was livid. Her face turned purple with rage. She wanted nothing more than to throw Bruce into the chokey anyway, but the problem was he had obeyed her. He had done exactly what she told him to do. Defeated, she stormed off, leaving behind a hall full of cheering students and one very full, but victorious, Bruce Bogtrotter. Matilda watched the scene with newfound determination. Bruce had won in his own way, and she was going to win in hers, because now she had something Trunchbull didn't know about. She had power, and soon she would learn how to use it. Matilda could hardly believe what she had discovered about herself. The pencil had moved. The glass of water had wobbled. And she had done it, not with her hands, not with any trickery, but with her mind. She had spent the night experimenting, her excitement bubbling inside her like a secret too wonderful to share. She stared at objects, willing them to shift, to tremble, to obey her silent commands. The results were inconsistent at first, a tiny twitch here, a barely perceptible nudge there, but there was no denying it. Something inside her had awakened. But what was it? How did it work? And more importantly, what could she do with it? The questions swirled in her mind as she arrived at school the next morning. Crunkham Hall was just as cold and unwelcoming as ever. But today, Matilda felt different. There was an energy inside her, a quiet thrill that hadn't been there before. She had always known she was different from the other children, not just because of her intelligence, but because of the way her mind worked. Now she had proof. She had a power, and she would need it. For as cruel as Miss Trunchbull had been before, she had become even worse after the chocolate cake incident. She had been humiliated in front of the entire school, and if there was one thing the headmistress could not tolerate, it was losing. Her revenge came swiftly. That very morning, she stormed into Miss Honey's classroom, her presence turning the air thick with fear. The students froze in their seats. Nobody dared to breathe too loudly. Trunchbull's beady eyes swept across the room, searching for her next victim. Matilda sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on her desk. She wasn't afraid, not really, but she knew better than to draw attention to herself. "Stand up, you," Trunchbull suddenly barked, pointing at a small, nervous-looking boy named Nigel. Nigel nearly fell out of his chair in fright. He scrambled to his feet, his knees shaking. "What is 2 times 28? Trunchbull snapped. Nigel blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. Trunchbull's face twisted in disgust. "You don't know? What are they teaching you in this miserable excuse for a school?" She turned on Miss Honey. "You see, absolute nincompoops, the lot of them." Miss Honey, as always, remained calm. "Nigel is trying his best, Miss Trunchbull," she said gently. Trunchbull sneered. "His best. His best. His best is stupid." Nigel's face burned with shame. He wasn't a bad student, just a nervous one. But to Trunchbull, that didn't matter. Matilda felt a familiar anger rising inside her. The headmistress had no right to treat children like this. The injustice of it all made her skin prickle. Then, Trunchbull's attention shifted. "You," Matilda's heart skipped. Trunchbull's finger was pointing straight at her. Matilda stood up slowly, keeping her expression neutral. She had dealt with bullies before. She knew the best way to handle them was to stay calm. "You're the nasty little worm from the Wormwood family, aren't you?" Trunchbull spat. "That crook of a father and that idiot of a mother." Matilda's fingers curled into fists, but she forced herself to stay still. "My father is a businessman," she said evenly. Trunchbull barked out a laugh. "Businessman? Cheat is more like it. I've heard all about his little business." Matilda said nothing. Trunchbull loomed closer. "Tell me, you disgusting little goblin, what is 12 times 7? Matilda didn't even have to think. 84. Trunchbull's eyes narrowed. She had been expecting hesitation. 16 times 15. 240. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed Trunchbull's face. 9 times 13. 117. Trunchbull's nostrils flared. Miss Honey stepped in. "Matilda is exceptionally bright," she said quickly. "She has an advanced understanding of numbers and—" "Shut up," Trunchbull snapped. Miss Honey's lips pressed into a thin line. Matilda watched, her anger simmering. She hated the way Trunchbull spoke to Miss Honey. It was one thing to bully children, but an adult. A teacher, it was unfair. It was cruel. And suddenly, something deep inside Matilda snapped. A wild, electric energy surged through her. It was the same feeling she had when she moved the glass at home, the same tingling sensation in her fingertips. But this time, it was stronger. Her eyes flicked to the water glass on Trunchbull's desk. And then, without touching it, she willed it to move. The glass tipped. Water spilled across the desk. Trunchbull froze. Miss Honey gasped. The entire class stared. For a moment, there was utter silence. Then Trunchbull roared. "Who did that?" Nobody answered. The children sat wide-eyed, too terrified to speak. Trunchbull's eyes darted around the room, looking for someone to blame. Matilda held her breath. She knew what had happened. She had done it, with her mind. She barely had time to process it before Trunchbull grabbed a chair and hurled it against the wall. It clattered to the floor with a deafening crash. "I will not have trickery in my school," she bellowed. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And then, with one last furious glare, Trunchbull stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The moment she was gone, the classroom erupted into whispers. "Did you see that? The glass just fell over. What happened?" Matilda sat very still, her mind racing. She had done it. She had made the glass move. Miss Honey was staring at her, a mixture of shock and curiosity in her eyes. Matilda knew right then and there that she needed to talk to her. Because whatever this power was, she needed to understand it. And Miss Honey was the only person who could help. Matilda's mind buzzed with questions. The water glass had moved. She had made it move. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't dreaming. She had discovered something inside herself, something powerful, something unreal. But what was it? And why did she have it? She spent the rest of the school day in a haze, her mind caught in a whirlpool of thoughts. She barely noticed when her classmates whispered excitedly about Trunchbull's outburst. She hardly reacted when Lavender giggled about how the glass had tipped over as if guided by a ghostly hand. Matilda knew better. It wasn't a ghost. It was her, and she needed to understand how to control it. When the final bell rang, Matilda lingered behind, waiting until the other children had filed out. Miss Honey had been watching her all afternoon, a thoughtful look in her kind eyes. When they were alone, Matilda took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Miss Honey," she said hesitantly. Miss Honey looked up. "Yes, Matilda." Matilda hesitated for only a moment. Then, with quiet determination, she said, "I need to talk to you in private." Miss Honey studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me." They walked through the quiet corridors of Crunkham Hall, past the looming shadows of the school's stone walls, and out into the open air. Matilda followed Miss Honey across the field and through a small wooden gate that led away from the school grounds. They walked in silence. Matilda didn't know where they were going, but she trusted Miss Honey. Finally, they arrived at a tiny red cottage nestled at the edge of a quiet lane. It was the smallest house Matilda had ever seen, simple, humble, but somehow warm and inviting. A little wooden fence surrounded a patch of wildflowers, and a tiny chimney poked out from the roof. Miss Honey unlocked the door and gestured for Matilda to step inside. "Come in," she said gently. Matilda entered, looking around. The cottage was neat but sparsely furnished. A small table stood in the middle of the room with two mismatched chairs. A single bookshelf lined one wall, its contents neatly arranged. There was no sign of luxury, no television, no fancy furniture, no unnecessary decorations. Miss Honey set her bag down and gestured for Matilda to sit. "What did you want to talk about?" she asked, taking the seat across from her. Matilda folded her hands in her lap. She took a deep breath. "I think I have a special power," she said. Miss Honey's expression didn't change. She only tilted her head slightly, encouraging Matilda to go on. Matilda hesitated, then said, "I think I can move things with my mind." She expected Miss Honey to laugh. She expected skepticism, disbelief. But Miss Honey simply nodded, as if she had been expecting something extraordinary from Matilda all along. "Tell me what happened," she said. Matilda recounted everything, how she had first felt the strange energy at home, how the glass had moved in the classroom, how she had felt the power inside her, like a current waiting to be released. Miss Honey listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Matilda finished, there was a long silence. Then Miss Honey said softly, "Do you think you can do it again?" Matilda swallowed. She wasn't sure, but she wanted to try. Miss Honey glanced around the small room, then picked up an empty teacup from the table and placed it in front of Matilda. "Try," she encouraged. Matilda focused on the teacup. She felt the tingling sensation return, that same electric charge humming in her veins. She locked her eyes on the cup, concentrating, willing it to move. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the teacup wobbled. Matilda's heart pounded. She focused harder. The tingling grew stronger. And suddenly, the teacup tilted and tumbled onto its side. Miss Honey gasped. "Matilda!" Matilda's breath came fast. She had done it again. And this time, there was no question Miss Honey had seen it. For the first time since discovering her strange ability, Matilda didn't feel alone. Miss Honey leaned forward, her hands clasped together in wonder. "Matilda, this is extraordinary." Matilda looked up, hope shining in her eyes. "Do you think so?" "I know so," Miss Honey said firmly. She reached out and took Matilda's hands in her own. "You have an incredible gift." Matilda's mind raced. If she truly had this power, what did it mean? What could she do with it? And then another thought struck her. "Miss Honey," she said hesitantly, "I don't think this is normal. People don't just move things with their minds." Miss Honey nodded. "It isn't normal, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." Matilda bit her lip. She had spent her whole life surrounded by people who refused to see the truth. Her parents ignored her intelligence. Trunchbull denied fairness. The world seemed blind to injustice. But Miss Honey believed her, and that meant everything. Matilda sat back, exhaling slowly. "I want to learn how to control it," she said. Miss Honey nodded. "Then we'll figure it out together." Matilda felt something warm bloom in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a lonely, brilliant child trapped in a world that didn't understand her. She was something more. She had a power, and with Miss Honey's help, she was going to use it. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The days that followed Matilda's revelation were unlike any she had ever experienced. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a girl with an unusual intelligence, nor merely a child overlooked by her family. She was someone special. And for the first time, she had someone who believed in her. Miss Honey had always known Matilda was remarkable. But now, after witnessing the teacup move before her eyes, she was determined to help Matilda understand the depth of her abilities. After school, whenever possible, Matilda and Miss Honey would retreat to the tiny red cottage, where they would sit together and test Matilda's powers. At first, the movements were small, a spoon wobbling, a pencil rolling across the table. But as Matilda practiced, the tingling sensation in her head became more familiar, more controllable. She was learning to harness it, to direct it. It was exhilarating. One evening, as Matilda sat at the table, she decided to push herself further. A single candle flickered nearby, its small flame casting soft shadows on the walls. Matilda locked her eyes on it. She concentrated. She felt the energy rise within her, that same electric force. Slowly, the flame began to flicker not from a draft, but from her. A thrill shot through Matilda's chest. She pushed harder, willing the flame to sway, to bend to her will. Then the candle snuffed out completely. Matilda gasped. Miss Honey, who had been watching with quiet fascination, covered her mouth in astonishment. "Matilda," she whispered, "do you realize what you've done?" Matilda nodded, her breath coming fast. "I think I do." She was growing stronger, but neither of them could have guessed just how soon she would need that strength. The next day at school, something happened that would change everything. Trunchbull was in a mood. She stormed into the classroom, her heavy boots thudding against the floor, her nostrils flaring like an enraged bull. Miss Honey stepped aside, allowing the headmistress to prowl through the room like a beast searching for prey. Matilda and her classmates sat rigid in their seats. They knew what was coming. Trunchbull's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the rows of children, looking for any excuse to unleash her fury. And then, her gaze landed on a small, trembling boy near the front. "Eric," Trunchbull stomped toward him. "You, stand up." Eric scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "What did you say to me this morning?" Trunchbull demanded. Eric blinked. "And Miss Trunchbull, don't lie to me," Trunchbull bellowed. "I heard you. You breathed too loudly when I walked past. You dared to exist in my presence. You think that's acceptable?" Eric stammered, unable to respond. The entire classroom held its breath. Trunchbull grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground as though he weighed nothing. The room erupted in gasps. Miss Honey took a step forward. "Miss Trunchbull, please." Trunchbull ignored her. "Do you know what happens to naughty children?" Trunchbull growled at Eric. Matilda clenched her fists. The anger surged through her like a wave. She could feel the power bubbling beneath the surface, stronger than ever. It was waiting, begging to be unleashed. Trunchbull carried Eric toward the window. Matilda's heart pounded. She knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath, focusing with everything she had. The tingling flooded her head. She locked her gaze on the blackboard behind Trunchbull. And then the chalk lifted. It hovered, unseen by anyone but Matilda. And then it moved. Slowly, carefully, Matilda guided the chalk across the board, her invisible force gripping it like an unseen hand. She wrote the first letter, then the next. Across the classroom, one of the children gasped. A hush fell over the room. Trunchbull froze. The chalk continued to write, steady and deliberate. The letters formed words. Trunchbull turned slowly, her eyes widening in horror. The message on the blackboard was clear. "Agatha, this is Magnus." Trunchbull staggered backward. Matilda pushed harder, her entire body trembling with the effort. "You have wronged Miss Honey." Trunchbull's face drained of color. The children sat frozen, watching in stunned silence. Miss Honey clutched her hands to her chest. Matilda wasn't just moving objects anymore, she was speaking. Through the chalk, through the message, through her power. "Give back her home, give back her money." Trunchbull let out a strangled gasp. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. Matilda could feel her own strength waning, but she forced herself to finish the message. The final words appeared, "Or I will come for you." Silence. Absolute, utter silence. And then Trunchbull screamed. A blood-curdling, terrified shriek. She stumbled backward, knocking over a desk, her limbs flailing. The classroom erupted into chaos. Trunchbull spun wildly, as if trying to escape an unseen force. She ran, out the door, down the hall, her terrified screams echoing through the school. And just like that, she was gone. Miss Honey turned slowly toward Matilda. Matilda was exhausted. She felt as though she had just run miles without stopping. Her limbs were weak, her head light, but she had done it. She had won. Miss Honey took a shaky breath. "Matilda," she whispered. The children erupted into cheers. And for the first time in her life, Matilda felt truly powerful. Trunchbull's departure from the classroom left behind a stunned silence, broken only by the distant echoes of her terrified screams as she fled down the corridor. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then, as though released from a spell, the students burst into wild cheering. Matilda sat still, catching her breath, her heart pounding from the sheer force of what had just happened. She had always known she was different, brighter, sharper, more attuned to things beyond the ordinary. But this was something beyond even her own imagination. She had defeated Miss Trunchbull, not with brute strength or rebellion, but with the very thing that made her special, her mind. Miss Honey looked at her with something close to awe. "Matilda," she whispered, leaning down so only she could hear, "was that you?" Matilda hesitated only a moment before nodding. Miss Honey exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. She had seen remarkable things in her life, had taught students of all kinds, but never, not once, had she witnessed something like this. The chalk had moved on its own, or rather, Matilda had moved it. And now, the monstrous Miss Trunchbull, who had ruled over Crunkham Hall with an iron grip, was gone. The rest of the school quickly caught wind of what had happened. Children whispered in hushed, excited voices, passing the tale like folklore. By lunchtime, the entire school was abuzz with rumors. Some claimed a ghost had written the message on the board. Others swore Trunchbull had collapsed in the hallway, muttering about Magnus, the long-dead father of Miss Honey. And then, as if the universe itself had decided that her reign of terror had lasted long enough, Trunchbull vanished. Completely. The next morning, she simply did not return. The staff checked her office. Empty, her house, deserted. No one knew where she had gone. There was no farewell, no official resignation, no explanation. It was as though she had been erased. The school erupted into celebration. For the first time in years, there was no looming fear of the chokey, no risk of being hurled across the playground for speaking out of turn. The teachers, long oppressed under Trunchbull's rule, found themselves stepping into a world where they could teach without fear. And at the center of it all stood Matilda. She had never asked to be a hero. She had never wanted to stand in the spotlight, but she had changed everything. For Miss Honey, the victory was deeply personal. Not only had Trunchbull terrorized the children, but she had stolen her life, her house, her money, her security. Now, with Trunchbull's abrupt disappearance, all of that was in question. Miss Honey took Matilda's hand one afternoon and led her away from the excited chatter of the other students. "There's something I need to find out," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. They made their way to Trunchbull's grand, towering house, the house that had once belonged to Miss Honey's father. The front door was unlocked. Slowly, cautiously, they stepped inside. The air inside the house was eerily still. The heavy furniture, the grand staircase, the thick curtains, it was all exactly as Miss Honey remembered. But something was different. The presence that had once dominated this space, the overwhelming, oppressive force that was Miss Trunchbull, was gone. Miss Honey moved through the house, her fingers brushing against the dust-covered furniture. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Matilda," she murmured. "If she's really gone," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But Matilda understood. If Trunchbull was truly gone, then Miss Honey could reclaim what was rightfully hers. They searched the house, room by room, and soon found the papers Miss Honey had been looking for, documents proving that the house, the money, and everything Trunchbull had stolen had belonged to Miss Honey's father. And now, with Trunchbull gone, it all belonged to her. Tears welled in Miss Honey's eyes as she realized the truth. She was free. Trunchbull had spent years trying to erase any trace of her kindness, her warmth, her very existence. But in the end, Miss Honey had won, and Matilda had helped her do it. As they left the house, stepping into the bright afternoon light, Miss Honey turned to Matilda with a look of deep gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Matilda smiled. "You don't have to." From that moment on, life at Crunkham Hall changed completely. With Trunchbull gone, the school transformed almost overnight. No more punishments, no more fear. The teachers took control, ensuring that kindness, rather than cruelty, ruled the halls. And for the first time in their lives, the children of Crunkham Hall were truly happy. But as Matilda's world at school flourished, her life at home remained unchanged. Her parents still ignored her, treating her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Her father, Mr. Wormwood, was still a crooked businessman, selling faulty cars to unsuspecting customers. Her mother remained utterly uninterested in her daughter's astonishing intellect. They had no idea that Matilda was the reason Trunchbull had vanished. They had no idea that she had changed everything. And they certainly had no idea that soon, very soon, Matilda's life would take another unexpected turn. Because while Matilda had never needed her family's approval, there was one thing she had always longed for: a place where she truly belonged. And it was closer than she ever could have imagined. Matilda had never felt more alive. With Trunchbull gone, Crunkham Hall had transformed into a place of joy rather than fear. The students walked freely without the weight of impending punishment. The teachers, no longer under the oppressive rule of their tyrant headmistress, found themselves able to teach with kindness. And at the heart of it all was Matilda. Though she never boasted about her role in Trunchbull's downfall, the entire school seemed to understand that she had been the catalyst. There were whispers about how Trunchbull had run away in terror after the mysterious message from Magnus appeared on the board. Some students even claimed Matilda had summoned the spirit herself. Matilda did not correct them. She simply smiled and continued, as she always had, absorbing every book she could find, thinking thoughts far beyond her years, and soaking in the newfound peace of her world. But even as the days passed and the school settled into its new, peaceful rhythm, something changed for Matilda. The power, the incredible telekinetic ability she had discovered, was fading. At first, it was subtle. She noticed it when she tried to move a pencil from one side of her desk to the other. The pencil barely quivered before rolling to a stop. A few days later, she attempted to lift a piece of chalk like she had done before. Nothing happened. It wasn't long before she realized the truth. The power was disappearing. At first, she felt a pang of loss. It had been extraordinary, the ability to reach out with her mind, to move objects with a simple thought. It had been something that set her apart, something special. But as she thought about it more, she began to understand why it was fading. The power had come to her when she had needed it most. It had emerged from her mind when she was trapped in an environment of cruelty and injustice, when she had needed a way to fight back against Trunchbull's reign of terror. But now, the school was safe. Miss Honey was free, and Matilda was happy. Perhaps, she thought, the power had only ever been a reflection of her inner turmoil. Now that her world had settled, her mind no longer needed such extraordinary abilities. One afternoon, she sat in the classroom after all the other students had gone home, lost in thought. Miss Honey, as always, was there, watching over her with quiet affection. Matilda finally looked up and spoke. "Miss Honey, I think I've lost it." Miss Honey frowned. "Lost what?" "My power," Matilda admitted. "I can't do it anymore. I can't move things with my mind." Miss Honey studied her carefully. She had always believed there was something remarkable about Matilda, something beyond the ordinary. But she also understood that Matilda's true power had never been her telekinesis. It had always been her mind. "I don't think you've lost anything, Matilda," she said gently. "I think you've gained something instead." Matilda tilted her head. "Like what?" "Peace." The words settled between them. Miss Honey smiled and reached for a book on her desk. "You've always been extraordinary, Matilda. Not because you could move things, but because of who you are." Matilda smiled back. She had spent so much of her life feeling out of place, too smart for her family, too unnoticed in a world that didn't seem to care. But here, in this classroom, with Miss Honey, she felt understood. And that meant more to her than any supernatural gift ever could. But while things at school had improved, her home life remained as cold and distant as ever. Her father was still engaged in shady business dealings, selling second-hand cars with sawdust in their engines. Her mother remained fixated on bingo and television, oblivious to everything else. And her brother, Michael, continued to be the favored child simply for doing the bare minimum of what was expected of him. One evening, as Matilda sat at the dining table reading while her parents ignored her, Mr. Wormwood suddenly stormed into the room. His face was red, his hair disheveled, his eyes darting back and forth as if expecting police officers to burst through the door at any moment. "We have to go," he barked. Matilda looked up, confused. "Go where?" "Out of the country," Mr. Wormwood snapped. "Tonight," her mother gasped. "What? Why?" "They've caught on to me," Mr. Wormwood growled. "The cops, those slimy little ugh. They're onto the cars. They know I've been fixing the mileage, and they're coming for me." Panic filled the room. Mrs. Wormwood let out a dramatic wail. "Oh, Harry, how could you let this happen?" "It doesn't matter," he spat. "We're leaving. I got us tickets to Spain." Matilda felt her stomach drop. They were leaving. Just like that. She barely had time to process it before her mother turned to her, pointing an accusatory finger. "You too, Matilda. Get your things. Now." Matilda felt a surge of panic. She thought of her school, her classmates, the library, the place where she had spent so many hours escaping into books. And most of all, she thought of Miss Honey. The thought of leaving her, of leaving the one person who had ever truly seen her, was unbearable. She took a deep breath. "Miss Honey," she said suddenly. "I want to live with Miss Honey." Her parents froze. Mr. Wormwood narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I don't want to go with you," Matilda said, her voice steady. "You don't even like me." Mrs. Wormwood gasped, as if personally insulted. "What a horrible thing to say." "It's true," Matilda said calmly. "You never cared about me, but Miss Honey does." Her parents exchanged glances. It was obvious they had never given much thought to their daughter. She had been more of an afterthought, something to be tolerated rather than cherished. And now, when faced with the idea of leaving her behind, Mr. Wormwood shrugged. "Fine, you want to stay here. Stay here." Mrs. Wormwood hesitated, but only for a moment. Well, if that's what she wants. And just like that, the decision was made. Matilda was free, no begging, no tears, just a simple acknowledgement that she was unwanted. As they gathered their things and rushed out the door, Matilda stood still, watching them go. For a moment, she felt something close to sadness. Not because she loved them, but because she had never been loved by them. And then, just as quickly, that feeling was replaced by something else. Relief. She turned and ran as fast as she could, straight to Miss Honey's house, where the warm light glowed from inside. She knocked on the door, breathless. Miss Honey opened it, eyes wide in surprise. Matilda looked up at her, smiling. "They're gone." Miss Honey stared for a moment, then knelt down and pulled Matilda into a tight, warm hug. And just like that, Matilda finally had a home. For the first time in her life, Matilda woke up feeling truly at home. The small cottage that had once been Miss Honey's lonely sanctuary was now filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet companionship of two souls who had finally found their family in each other. Matilda's old life felt like a distant dream. Gone were the blaring televisions, the dismissive glances from her parents, the feeling of being invisible in her own home. Instead, she awoke to the smell of tea brewing, the sound of birds outside the window, and the knowledge that she was wanted. Miss Honey, too, felt the difference. The little house that had once seemed so empty was now alive with Matilda's presence. Every evening, they sat together at the small kitchen table, talking about books, mathematics, and the wonders of the world. For Miss Honey, who had spent so long under the shadow of Miss Trunchbull, it was as if she had been given a second chance at happiness. Matilda still went to school every day, eager to learn and grow. But now she had something else, a real home to return to. And even though she had lost her extraordinary telekinetic ability, she hardly missed it. Life, for once, felt ordinary. And for Matilda, ordinary was wonderful. One afternoon, as she sat in Miss Honey's classroom, working through an advanced mathematics book far beyond her years, Miss Honey stopped by her desk and watched her with quiet admiration. "You really are something else, Matilda," she said with a smile. Matilda looked up. "Is it strange that I don't miss my power?" Miss Honey shook her head. "Not at all. Maybe you don't need it anymore. Maybe you never did." Matilda considered this, nodding. "I suppose I always had something better." Miss Honey tilted her head. "And what's that?" Matilda smiled. "A brain." Miss Honey laughed, and Matilda joined her. But as happy as they were, Matilda's sharp mind couldn't help but notice something curious. The moment Miss Trunchbull had disappeared, everything in their lives had changed. Miss Honey had gotten her home back. The school had been freed from tyranny, and Matilda herself had found a new life. It was as if all the terrible things Trunchbull had inflicted on them had vanished along with her. And yet, there was something unfinished, something still lurking in the air. Miss Trunchbull had left everything behind. Her house, her possessions, her position at the school, everything she had once controlled was now abandoned. But where had she gone? No one had seen her since that day in the classroom. There were rumors, of course. Some students whispered that she had fled the country, others that she had simply disappeared into the woods, swallowed up by the ghosts of her own past. Matilda didn't know what to believe, but a part of her suspected that the story of Agatha Trunchbull wasn't quite over. One evening, as she and Miss Honey sat by the fire, Matilda asked, "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Miss Honey didn't answer right away. She stirred her tea, her expression unreadable. "No," she said at last. "I don't think so." Matilda frowned. "But aren't you worried?" Miss Honey looked up, her eyes warm but steady. "Not anymore." Matilda studied her. There was something in her teacher's voice that she had never heard before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even relief. It was certainty. Miss Trunchbull was gone, and for the first time, Miss Honey truly believed it. The next morning at school, Matilda was called to the head teacher's office. Unlike before, when the mere thought of entering that room would have sent shivers down her spine, she walked in calmly. Mrs. Phelps, the librarian who had first introduced Matilda to books, was waiting there along with the acting headmistress, Miss Plimsoll. "Matilda, dear," Mrs. Phelps said warmly, "we've been reviewing your academic progress." Miss Plimsoll smiled. "And we've come to an unusual conclusion." Matilda tilted her head. "What conclusion?" Miss Plimsoll folded her hands. "You don't belong in this class." For a moment, Matilda's heart sank. Had she done something wrong? Had she somehow managed to get in trouble even without Miss Trunchbull around? Miss Plimsoll saw the look on her face and chuckled. "No, my dear, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that you're far, far ahead of your peers. Frankly, you should be in a much higher grade." Matilda's eyes widened. Mrs. Phelps nodded in agreement. "Miss Honey has been telling us about your abilities for a long time. Now that we're free from Trunchbull's methods, we can finally do what's best for you." Matilda felt a thrill of excitement. Moving up a grade meant harder books, more complex lessons, more challenges. She couldn't wait. But then, something unexpected happened. Miss Plimsoll hesitated. "We were thinking of placing you in the highest level, the secondary school." Matilda's breath caught. That was a huge leap. She would be with students much older than her teenagers even. Was she ready for that? She turned to Miss Honey, searching her face for an answer. Miss Honey's expression was soft, but there was something else in her eyes. Something that made Matilda pause. "Would you like that, Matilda?" Miss Honey asked. Matilda thought for a moment. The idea of being surrounded by older students didn't scare her. She knew she could handle the work probably better than anyone else in that class. But she liked this classroom. She liked being with Miss Honey. For the first time in her life, she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to escape, to fight for a place where she was valued. She already had it. She shook her head. "I think I'd like to stay." Miss Plimsoll and Mrs. Phelps exchanged a look of surprise. "Are you sure?" Miss Plimsoll asked. "You have the ability to go much farther." Matilda nodded. "I will go farther, but I don't want to rush." Miss Honey's eyes gleamed with quiet pride. Mrs. Phelps smiled. Then it settled. And just like that, Matilda made a choice, not for survival, not for escape, but simply because it was what she wanted. She had spent her whole life being pushed aside, underestimated, and ignored. But now, she had control. She had a home, she had a future, and she would live it on her own terms. As she walked out of the office and back toward the classroom, she felt lighter than she ever had before. There were no more battles to fight, no more enemies to defeat. For once, Matilda was simply free to be. And that was the happiest ending she could have ever imagined. The days that followed were unlike anything Matilda had ever known. With Miss Trunchbull gone, and the school now a place of learning instead of fear, life took on a new kind of rhythm. The students who had once cowered in terror now laughed freely in the hallways. There was no more choky, no more sudden outbursts of punishment, no more cruel tricks to keep them in line. For the first time, Crunkham Hall Primary School felt like a real school. The teachers, freed from Miss Trunchbull's tyranny, seemed to breathe easier, their lessons livelier and their voices kinder. Miss Plimsoll, now acting as headmistress, had taken steps to ensure that the students were treated with care and respect. It was a transformation so complete that even Matilda, who had seen it all unfold, sometimes had trouble believing it. For Matilda herself, life had never been better. She spent her days immersed in the joy of learning, absorbing new books and ideas with the same voracious curiosity she had always possessed. She remained in Miss Honey's class, despite being offered a place in the secondary school, and she felt certain she had made the right decision. There was something right about being there, something good. Yet, despite the happiness that had settled into her life, Matilda couldn't shake the occasional thought of her parents. She hadn't seen much of them since she had moved in with Miss Honey. They barely seemed to notice she was gone, and the few times she did return to her old house, the atmosphere was just as it had always been, detached, indifferent, filled with the sounds of the television and the ever-present hum of her father's dubious business dealings. But even their neglect had started to take on a new shape. There was a tension in the air whenever Matilda visited. Her father seemed more agitated than usual, his phone calls sharper, his tone more defensive. Her mother, usually so wrapped up in her bingo games and shallow conversations, had begun packing things into boxes, as though preparing for something. Matilda was no fool. She knew what was coming. And sure enough, one evening, as she sat curled up in Miss Honey's small living room with a book on her lap, there came a frantic knock at the door. Miss Honey looked up from her tea, startled. Matilda closed her book and stood. "I think I know who that is." When she opened the door, she was greeted by the sight of her father, red-faced and sweating, standing on the doorstep. Behind him, her mother and brother stood by the car, both looking more irritated than concerned. "Matilda," Mr. Wormwood barked, "get your things. We're leaving." Matilda crossed her arms. "Leaving where?" "Spain," he said shortly. "We're moving tonight." Matilda's stomach tightened. She had known something was happening, but this... Mrs. Wormwood sighed impatiently. "Come on, Matilda. We don't have time for this. Your father's in a bit of trouble, and we need to go." Now, Matilda glanced back at Miss Honey, who had risen from her chair, her face carefully neutral. "You're running away," Matilda said plainly, turning back to her father. "Because of your business," Mr. Wormwood's face darkened. "Never you mind about that. You're our daughter, and you're coming with us." Matilda didn't move. "No, I'm not." There was a brief silence. Mrs. Wormwood groaned. "For goodness sake, Harry, just leave her. She's never been any use to us anyway." Matilda barely reacted. The words stung, but they were expected. Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You really don't want to come?" "No," Matilda said, her voice steady. Mr. Wormwood huffed, glancing back at the car. "Fine," he said at last. "Stay here then, see if I care." He turned on his heel and stomped back to the car. Mrs. Wormwood didn't even bother saying goodbye. Michael, her brother, hesitated for a second. He looked at Matilda, not with anger, not with sadness, just mild confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand why she wasn't going with them. Then, without a word, he climbed into the car. Matilda and Miss Honey stood in the doorway, watching as the Wormwoods drove away, disappearing down the road without so much as a backward glance. Matilda let out a small breath. Miss Honey placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're free now," she murmured. Matilda turned to her and smiled. "I always was." And just like that, the chapter of her life that had been filled with neglect, loneliness, and struggle was closed. Matilda Wormwood was no longer a forgotten child in a house that never wanted her. She was Matilda Honey. She belonged. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of joy. Matilda and Miss Honey fell into a routine that was easy, natural. Every morning, they walked to school together, discussing books and ideas as the world slowly woke around them. Matilda had always loved learning, but now, more than ever, she embraced it, not as an escape, but as a path forward, a way to build the life she had always deserved. Evenings were spent reading by the fire, sharing stories, laughing over cups of tea. There was no more need for grand plans or extraordinary powers. Matilda didn't need magic to be remarkable. She always had been. As the months passed, Matilda watched as the school continued to flourish under Miss Plimsoll's leadership. The shadow of Miss Trunchbull faded into distant memory, and Crunkham Hall became a place of genuine education. Miss Honey, too, blossomed. No longer burdened by fear, she became the teacher she had always wanted to be: kind, patient, brilliant. Her students adored her, and she thrived in the home that was rightfully hers. And Matilda grew. She grew not just in knowledge, but in happiness. She found friends, mentors, a sense of belonging. She continued to read, to learn, to challenge herself. She still amazed her teachers with her intellect, but she no longer needed to prove anything. She was simply allowed to be Matilda. There were no more battles to fight, no more cruel headmistresses to outwit, no more neglectful parents to endure. There was only the wide, open future stretching ahead of her, filled with infinite possibilities. And as Matilda sat by the window one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt something deep inside her settle. For the first time in her life, she was truly, perfectly happy. And that, she thought, was the greatest story of all. And with that, we reach the end of Matilda's journey. A story of resilience, intelligence, and finding one's place in the world. Roald Dahl's Matilda remains a timeless tale that reminds us of the power of knowledge, kindness, and standing up for what is right.